All right, so welcome to the next lecture. Um, this lecture is on the group of thinkers who were around before Socrates. So, a good place to start when it comes to this conversation is with a group, a number of individuals known as the Vates. Um, and just a quick disclaimer, I'm not versed in ancient Greek or Latin, so a lot of my pronunciations I'm totally making up. Don't think that this is how you should pronounce these, right? So the Vates, right, is a Latin word. Remember that Latin is the language of the ancient Romans. And Vates in Latin means both prophet and poet. And so the Vates, which is the prophet and poet, right? It's one person who's kind of both. Um, was basically a key figure for answering the big questions before the time of Socrates and before philosophy. Um, so remember that one thing we've talked about before was how uh, philosophy is about the big questions about existence. So since even before we had language, human beings have always been asking, you know, what makes things in nature happen. What that you can think of our ancient ancestors, back when we were still hunter gatherers, and maybe even before we were human beings with the Neanderthal, freaking out when they see lightning and thunder from a major storm landing right on top of their heads. So even if they didn't really have language, when we were still kind of grunting and gesturing, um, there would have been questions about what that was, right? And so, also, what exactly is death? What happens afterwards, right? What is it that's good, and why is it good, and why do we exist? And so, very early on, before we had philosophers and scientists, we had a shaman, a medicine man, a medicine woman, a priest, a priestess, a prophet. Um, these type of individuals uh, were basically religious leaders, um, who tried to provide answers through stories. You have to remember that, it was the shaman and the medicine man, the priestess, the witch, um, and the prophets were your poets. They were the ones who came up with the stories trying to explain what lightning was and where thunder was coming from and what happened after death. So it was through stories that we would try to come up with answers, that we came up with theories of truth. And that was what your vates was, right? That's why the Romans understood this, and they had one word for, because for them it was kind of the same person was both. They were a storyteller, like a poet, but they were also like your prophet, because here prophet doesn't mean telling you the future. They were as in like messenger of the gods, right? And so, they believed back in the ancient time periods before the philosophers that the gods would send these truths down into certain people. And so these stories were not something that they were making up, but according to their beliefs, these stories were the answers of the gods, right? Um, and so, you know, for a, the majority of our human history, and even before we were humans, right? Storytelling is a key component of truth. We need to be able to put it into a story in order to make sense of it, in order to understand it. Um, and so that's why this idea of truth and answers and storytelling becomes something fused together in the Romans, right? They, and as I mentioned, they kind of believed in this idea of possession by gods and goddesses, whose wisdom and poetry sang out through the mouths of these human mortals. And so this is where we get, for example, the Greeks had the idea of the muses, right? They had a muse for music, a muse for poetry, a muse for painting, and a muse for dance and so on and so forth, right? These goddesses that would like physically inhabit the poet and lead them to come up with these, wonderful stories that were meant to give out truth about who we are and where we come from and how we should live, right? And so this is a very ancient and old way of thinking. And so this, what we call mythology nowadays for ancient Mediterranean cultures like Mesopotamia and Egypt and Ethiopia and Greece and Rome, um, these stories that we call mythology were not just entertainment, they were sources of higher truth that explained how the world worked and that used characters like gods and heroes to model how people should behave, and then used other characters like villains and monsters to warn against how you should not behave, right? In fact, the word monster comes from the same root in Latin again as monstrar in Spanish, which means to show, which is where we get the word demonstrate, right? So monster is a showing, a warning, right? Um, of what not to do, just like the heroes and the gods are an example of what should be modeled, what we should be doing, right? So these stories again were not just entertainment; these mythological stories, right? They were meant to kind of teach about life, about nature, about the gods, about religion, about politics, and about ethics and morality as well. Then, somewhere along the way, somewhere around the 6th century BCE, right, which means before the Common Era, for those of you that are more religious, is what most of you would refer to as before Christ, but now we refer to it as the before the Common Era. There was a group of ancient Greeks called the Ionians, named after the place in Greece where they came from, right? The Ionians included a group of thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, Anaxagoras, and Archelaus. Archelaus. Sometimes I'd struggle with some of these, right? So um, these Ionians, right? There's a group of individual thinkers. Aristotle referred to them as the physiologi, or natural philosophers. I mentioned this in the last lecture, right? This was the term for scientists before we came up with the word scientist. So, natural philosophers were philosophers who stuck to questions about nature, who were trying to understand nature. Um, and they were also sometimes called cosmologists because they studied the stars and multiple maths. That's not a typo there, right? Math, as in like multiple maths, as in like algebra, geometry, calculus, trigonometry, and so on. There's multiple maths out there. And so these Ionians, they studied the stars, but they also studied, you know, earth and water and fire and living things, and they were trying to kind of figure out how it all worked. Um, and they created as well cosmogonies or cosmologies, which are stories about how the universe began. And mostly they were what we call physicalists, right? They were trying to like physically understand the physical universe and come up with physical explanations for those, rather than talking about, gods and spirits, or, you know, um, monsters and heroes to explain stuff. These guys were trying to understand it on a physical level, in terms of physical cause and effect. And so these natural philosophers, in particular these Ionians, right, they're the ones who gave us our first steps to what would much later become what we call science, physical science, right? And so one of the things they were trying to do is they were trying to understand nature by understanding its fundamental element, what they called an arche or an arcos, right? And what they meant by that is they thought that everything in the universe could eventually be traced down to like one basic element that everything else was made out of, right? Something that did not change, right? The arche, as you can see there. Um, and so for Thales, the arche for him was water. He thought that all things were basically made out of water. Um, the nearest that we can tell is more than likely he was probably looking at more biological material more than anything, right? He was looking at plants and animals, and that's probably what made him conclude that that everything's made out of water because living things are mostly made out of water. However, instead, Anaximenes, for him, the arche was air, right? For he thought that, fundamentally, air is you could break everything down to a form of air, um, and another example of this is Heraclitus. He's probably one of the most famous ones out of these guys. For him, everything was made out of fire, right? There was some, you could take, um, trees and humans and animals and blocks of rock, and each of these guys thought that if you could somehow break them down to the most basic level, what you would find is, water for Thales, air for Anaximenes, and fire for Heraclitus. Now, Heraclitus doesn't just stop there. He says if things are made out of fire, he comes up with this conclusion that that means that change is real and stability is an illusion, right? Heraclitus is the one that tells us that everything flows, nothing really stands still. And he's most famous for telling us that no man can cross the same river twice because neither the man nor the river are the same. So Heraclitus, because for him, everything is made out of fire, which is not stable, something that's constantly in motion, right? And he thought that everything was made out of that. He thought that, like stability, for example, thinking that your house is the same, is an illusion, right? Um, he felt that things were constantly changing underneath the surface. We just couldn't see it or perceive it, but that the reality was that everything was in constant motion. Now, this is this is just what he thought, but the interesting part is that we kind of now know that he's right, actually, right? In terms of physics, we know that atoms are constantly, like the subatomic particles are constantly in motion, right? Electrons are constantly revolving around protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and that these create molecules, and the molecules are constantly undergoing different kinds of changes, like chemical reactions and so on. So, on some level, Heraclitus was wrong about fire being everything being made out of fire, but he was right in terms of change is real, stability is an illusion, in the sense that things are not like a chunk of thing that just stays the same, and that underneath the surface things are constantly in motion. So, it just kind of an interesting side note. Heraclitus was not too wrong. He was just kind of, wrong about how it happened or why it happened, right? Now, that's just one example of the Ionians, right? Um, and just like you had the Ionians, you also had another group of people that came in around the same time, a little bit later, called the Eleatics, right? The Eleatics was another pre-Socratic, before Socrates, school. This is a school of thought from ancient Greece, who were also trying to explain nature and reality. So these were also physiologi, or natural philosophers. These guys were in the 5th century BCE, which means that they were, in 50 to 100 years later than the other guys we just talked about. And these guys were from a different. They weren't from they were from a different section. Um, Italy wasn't Italy yet, and it wasn't Rome yet. It was still technically part of the Greeks. It was like a Greek colony, but it's in what we would today call southern Italy, not too far from Sicily. And so these Eleatics, they advocated a strict metaphysical view of monism, um, in response to the material monism advocated by the Ionians. So that's a mouthful, right? What does that mean? So in other words, um, these guys did believe that everything was one, just like the other guys, but instead of thinking it was something, this one thing made out of fire, or this one thing made out of water, or this one thing made out of air, right? The Eleatics believed that everything was made out of like something like mind, for example, right? Something else, something otherworldly in a way. Um, and so, probably one of the most famous of these Eleatics are Parmenides and Zeno, right? Um, we won't focus on Zeno so much because he would take like a whole class on metaphysics for us to get into Zeno and his paradoxes. He's famous for creating paradoxes that kind of boggle the mind, um, and he's definitely interesting and worth checking out on your own time. But I want to focus instead on Parmenides because in many ways Parmenides agrees and disagrees with Heraclitus. So uh, Parmenides, we only know about him from a single poem that has survived. Now, it's he probably wrote more poems than this, or more ideas than this, but we only like the only one that survived is this one poem. We don't know what the title is for the poem because it didn't survive completely, right? Like there was parts of it that kind of decayed and fell apart over time. But we what we call it is we call it On Nature. That's the title we gave it, and by we I mean people who came in much later. Only fragments of this um, poem survive, and basically, what Parmenides does in the poem is he describes two views of reality. Um, he calls one the way of aletheia, or the way of truth, right? And in the way of truth, aletheia, basically all reality is one, and change is impossible, and existence is timeless and uniform. And what that means, it's open for debate, but the way I look at it is what he's trying to say is that the universe is actually one thing, okay? Like, you and I really aren't separate people. You and I are actually little cogs in a big machine called the universe, right? Kind of like ants in a colony, right? Or a spider on a web. Everything is interconnected. And so we're connected to each other and we're connected to everybody else. Like we're connected to, water and fire and hurricanes, and traffic and economies and political systems, right? As much as we think we're individuals with a free will, for Parmenides, the idea is that the universe is actually one complex machine with a whole bunch of little cogs and pieces that think that they are free and individual, but in fact they're just little cogs who fulfill their program or their function, right? And maybe thinking you're an individual is part of your function, right? It's how you operate, right? Um, does the little wheel inside the watch know that it's a wheel that's turning because it's forced to turn by other wheels whose teeth lock up into it, or is it aware of that, or does it think it's free to choose to keep turning, right? That's kind of a metaphor for us, and so for Parmenides, the universe is really one thing, and the universe doesn't really change at the end of it, right? The universe is still expanding and cooling off, and it doesn't really care whether you and I want to participate in in its functioning or in its expansion or in its cooling off, right? We do what we do, but in the end, we die and we add to the entropy of the universe and we cool off with the rest of the things around us. So that's the way I kind of read what Parmenides is saying, right? That basically the whole universe is really just one machine, and everything inside of it is just little tiny cogs that make that machine run. And so nothing really changes on the big scheme of things, is kind of what he's talking about. Now, he did say there was a second view, right? There's two ways of viewing reality. The second view is what he calls the way of doxa, or the way of opinion. Now, notice this is different from the way of truth, which we just talked about. So, notice truth versus opinion, right? Reality is one versus the world of appearances. Okay, um, so in the way of doxa, or the way of opinion, right? This is the world of illusion, because this is the world that we live in. This is where we go based off of what things appear to be, right? Just because we we appear to think and then do, right? Like my brain says, right hand move up, move side to side when I run into somebody across the street that I recognize or that's a friend of mine. So in my head, it appears to me like I'm thinking and choosing for my hand to go up and wave at my friend, right? This is an opinion I have that I'm free to choose whether to wave or not. But notice what Parmenides is arguing is that it's an illusion. It's a lie. We're being deceived because the reality is that I'm being caused to wave, right? Because it is if my friend weren't there, would I wave? No, I wouldn't. If I were mad at my friend, would I wave? No, I wouldn't, right? So there, it's we're actually cogs in the machine, right? That's the reality. We're not choosing to wave. We're being caused to wave. So there's the reality about how we're part of a chain of cause and effect, and then there's the opinion or the world of appearances, which is based off of the illusion that we have free will, for example, right? So this is kind of like the two ways that Parmenides talks about, right? The way of truth versus the way of appearance or opinion. Um, and so right now I'm just kind of giving you some of these ideas that these thinkers are thinking about. I'm trying to show you that like we're moving away from stories, right? The Vates, the poet, the prophet, they would answer with stories, right? Oh, Zeus was angry at somebody, so he struck him down with lightning, for example, right? That's a story. Now with the Ionians and the Eleatics, instead we're moving into explanations instead of stories, right? They're giving us like causal explanations about what they see happening around them. And so now the key thing is that both the Eleatics and the Ionians stick to science, right? They stick to the physical world. That's what they're concerned with. And so then we get to a third group, which are called the Sophists. The Sophists were professional teachers and tutors. Sorry, they were professional teachers and tutors. That meant that they got paid to teach usually young, wealthy men of Athens how to manage their affairs in order to reach eudaimonia. Now, eudaimonia is a key word here. We're going to be studying this word quite a bit and talking about it quite a bit. Literally, what eudaimonia means in Greek means the good voice, right? Daimonion is this idea of a voice in your head that is a result of a possession by something outside of you, right? And so there's good, EU at the beginning means good, right? So there's good voices and then there's bad voices for the ancient Greeks. Good voices would be like the gods. They possess you and they're giving you wisdom and they're trying to help you lead to like a good life, right? A bad voice would be like demons or spirits or monsters or maybe even the gods when they're upset with you and they drive you mad, right? They make you go insane and you begin to hear and see things that aren't there or whatever, right? That would be a bad voice that leads usually to a bad life. You um, go off the deep end and you make decisions that destroy your life or you end up killing yourself or something to that effect. So for the Greeks, there's this idea of good voices and bad voices happening in here, right? And eudaimonia literally means when the good voice comes to help you out. But eventually, right, because of this way of thinking, eudaimonia wound up becoming this idea of a good life, right, or happiness. And so, during the time of the Vates, they wanted to find a way to reach the good voice so they would be possessed by the good gods to help them make good decisions and tell good stories and get rewarded, etc. But by the time we get to the Sophists, right, the idea of eudaimonia becomes they forget about the possession idea and they stick just to the idea of the good life or the happiness. So eudaimonia eventually becomes literally a good life or happiness. That's what it means. So these Sophists, these professional tutors, what they're doing is they promise that if you pay them, they will teach your young son, who will eventually take over your house, how to like manage their affairs so that they can reach eudaimonia, right? Now you have to remember, what does that mean to manage your affairs? You have to remember that in Athens at the time, They had what's called a direct democracy. A direct democracy is basically where citizens are in charge of running the government themselves, right? There's no lawyers, so if you're suing someone, you have to go in there and argue. If you're being sued from by somebody, you have to go in and argue, right? There's no such thing as lawyers. If you're being charged with a crime, you have to go in there and defend yourself. If you want to pass a new law, you have to debate that law. If you, you want to run for office, you have to kind of make your own speeches. There's no such thing as like a press aide or a speech writer. Instead, you kind of do this all yourself. So people literally, the citizens, which were upper class Greek men mostly, they like literally ran the court and ran the government themselves. So what the sophists are promising is that they're going to help you learn how to do a good job of that. And the number one thing that they were kind of really emphasizing was rhetoric, right? What is rhetoric? Rhetoric is the art of persuasion, right? One of the sophists was a dude named Gorgias. He wasn't good looking, that's just what his name was, right? And one of the quotes that he's famous for was he always promised that if you paid him, he would teach you to make the weaker argument into the stronger argument, right? So in other words, think about that. What makes an argument weaker? What makes an argument stronger, right? What he means by a stronger argument is a better argument, one that's more convincing. What he means by a weaker argument is one that's less convincing. Now, normally, if you know how to think about things, the stronger argument is the one with evidence, the one with facts, the one with truth. The weaker argument is the one with no facts, the one that has no proof whatsoever. That's for a person who is aware and able to analyze. Gorgias is arguing that he will make you so good at rhetoric, the art of persuasion, debate, and argument. He is so good at that he will make you be able to take a weak argument with no real proof, no real evidence, and yet present it convincingly enough so that people actually think you are arguing something stronger, right? Like he'll make you so good with speeches and words that people won't even notice that you don't even have any proof of what you're saying, right? And so already we're running into an issue here. Gorgias is promising to teach people how to convince other people without proof. So there's already kind of something undermining this idea of truth, this idea of evidence, the idea that proof is necessary for convincing people. Gorgias is attacking that. He's undermining it. And then things get worse with another one of the sophists named Protagoras, right? Protagoras tells us in this quote, concerning the gods, I have no means of knowing either that they exist or that they do not exist, nor what sort of form they may have. There are many reasons why knowledge on this subject is not possible, owing to the lack of evidence and the shortness of human life. So the first thing he's telling us is, I cannot prove that the gods are real. I don't know anything about the gods. The only thing I know is human existence because I'm human. And so the only thing I know is what it is to be human. So I got no answers for you when it comes to the gods, right? At first that seems like an honest answer, but then when you see what he follows it up with, we begin to see how it's going to lead us to problems, right? In the second quote, Protagoras tells us, man is the measure of things that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not, right? And the two quotes are actually connected. What he's telling us is that because we cannot know whether there is a God or not, right, in the end, we're stuck on our own down here on earth. And because of that, we got to rely on ourselves. And so we become the measure of all things. We measure what is truth. We decide what is real, and we decide what is not real. We become gods unto ourselves. We determine what is reality. That's what Protagoras is telling, right? And so between Gorgias and Protagoras, right, what they're teaching the young men of Athens, right, an entire generation, is that like reality is something that can be shaped based off of the strength of the mind of people, right? And so if you become good at speeches and you can like Jedi mind trick people's minds to get them to believe you, then you literally like are shaping the reality of the entire polis or the entire city state, right? Like you can create the reality of an entire group of people if you're just that good at speaking. Because in the end, these guys don't think people can think for themselves, right? And if you don't understand why this is dangerous, then maybe you should go look up a little bit of history, right? Adolf Hitler never shot anybody, but he was able to create what we called the Holocaust during World War II and create the Nazi regime because of words, because of his ability to convince people with speeches, right? He was able to convince the Germans that the Jewish people were a threat, right? That they were like enemy sleeper agents that were undermining German culture. And no proof whatsoever, no evidence, no facts, but just because he was good with words, he was be able to like create seeds of doubt and fear and anger, and that caused the Nazi movement. They literally, you guys forget you weren't, a lot of you weren't, none of you were there. It was 100 years before your time, but people forget Hitler was elected, right? So this is what Protagoras and Gorgias are getting at. All right. What's the result? The result is that they created a generation of Athenians that believed, rhetoric promised power and enough power to be able to shape public perceptions of reality, public opinion, right? When we talk about public opinion, we're talking about in large groups of people and what they think and what they believe. The result is that thanks to these guys, Athenian democracy suffered and wound up being under the control of the 30 tyrants, um, which were 30 citizens who took over for about 8 months, and they were in charge of the entire city. Um, and the word tyrant is not used lightly, right? They hated democracy, so they started doing things like getting rid of the vote, getting rid of the agora where people would hang out to debate. They literally condemned 1,500 people to death and took their property, right? Um, these guys, anybody disagreed with them, they would send, guys with weapons over to the house. They would pick them up out of their bed and drag them out in the middle of the night, and they would hang them or poison them or stab them. And so within 8 months, there were 1,500 citizens of Athens who were murdered, usually at night, because these guys wanted to keep power for themselves. Now, how did they rise up to power? By using what Gorgias and Protagoras had taught them. They used speech to get followers, and eventually they had enough followers where they decided, hey, why don't we just take over? And that was the end of democracy for about 8 months. Now, lucky for the Athenians, right? They were led by this guy named Critias, right? Lucky for the Athenians, eventually there was a revolt against them. Um, People who had left in a hurry when they saw what was happening, eventually enough of them had left. They got out. They got together outside of Athens. They decided to create their own army, and then they came back and invaded their own homeland. They caught the 30 tyrants. They killed Critias. A lot of his supporters ran and never came back to the city, and then they reestablished democracy, right? Um, but after so many had buried fathers and brothers, right? 1,500 of them under the 30 tyrants. A lot of the citizens of Athens were still afraid of new tyrants, and they blamed the sophists for creating the tyrants in the first place. So there was like, even though democracy got restored, there was still this atmosphere of paranoia and fear. And this sets up our next lecture. This is where Socrates comes into the picture. And as we'll see next lecture, it doesn't end well for Socrates because of the fear created in Athens by the sophists and by their students who became the tyrants. I I hope you enjoyed this lecture. All right, and I'll see you in the next lecture.